Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy.
Cool. Great. Welcome back, Becca. We're going to move into the technical portion. I think it's going to be a little more conversational, but I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. I will talk a little bit about my thought process. So I'll preface this by saying this is not a real world example from Formidable. When I interview people at Formidable, we're usually pretty focused on specific JavaScript questions or specific React pairing exercises. But something that I've encountered a lot in the real world as an interviewee is the system design interview. And like I said earlier, it's a challenge for me, and it's been on my mind a lot think through, like, what are these questions looking for? Do they help? Who are they designed to filter out or to bring in? So I was wondering if we could work through a system design interview question. And on the video, we do have some whiteboarding, but I want it to be more of a conversation about how we might approach this. Would you and I approach it differently? That kind of thing. So most system design interview questions are focused on a specific application. And I ran into one recently that was really, really interesting, and I want to talk through how we might approach building it. So one of my very favorite delivery services is GoPuff. Are you familiar with GoPuff?
Yes.
Yes.
I can't remember if they were a client in the past or I just knew people who represented them, but very familiar. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for anybody who's listening who's not familiar, GoPuff is a delivery service. By the way, I'm not advertising it at all. I just happen to be thinking about it as a service. But it's very localized, where in different neighborhoods they have like little mini warehouses, and I, as a user, can go on their app any time of day or night and say, hey, I want some ice cream and some Doritos. And then a delivery person will get that order, go to the little warehouse, pick up the ice cream and the Doritos, and deliver it to you. Now, there's a lot of logistics involved in that, such as if I'm going to order the ice cream, I need to make sure that it's in stock. And that needs to be really updated based on the local inventory, not like some global inventory warehouse. And, the driver needs to know what I ordered, where I live. And there's probably a lot of back end systems and logistical stuff involved in the user side, the driver side, and just the inventory management side.
Yeah.
So if you were designing that system from scratch, what would it look like?
A great question. So I'm going to cheat and take some of these things you mentioned, right? We have a user. We kind of have two different types of users, right? Let's say this is the delivery and then kind of driver user, right? Two definitely big cases we needed, or big things we need to solve for. You mentioned inventory management. I always ask people, please don't judge me on my spelling because I can't spell very well. Inventory management, and then we need some type of I know they have a mobile app, but basically a mobile app experience, right? Like if I'm thinking of the big picture stuff, this is kind of what it is, right? And if we've got some type of mobile app inventory management, I'm thinking is more of a middle layer back end, and these are basically users that are probably going to be some part of the model, but that's what's kind of driving these things. Is there anything else that's critical? I guess logistics. I don't know how much they GoPuff does this, but like the same type of like matching algorithm stuff that Uber does, right? Of like, we need to have a queue that we're basically filling up. The drivers that are next in the queue are going to get the ones that need to deliver things, right? That's something that would need to be, I don't know exactly where to add that, but let's just say
at least some sort of
queue.
matching algorithm to match each order with a driver.
Yeah. Order slash driver. So that's going to be important. I would say we're going to pay Google some money to pull in Google Maps, or basically implement that functionality. I'm assuming you can use Google Maps on mobile apps. We could pull in that functionality so we don't have to build a mapping system ourselves.
Yeah, we would use some sort of third-party service, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So
and I'm also guessing there would be some GPS element there so that you know where your driver is and how soon they'll be at your door.
Yeah. Totally. So that's the I guess that's like GPS / driver. I don't even know if it's driver management, but like delivery updates, right? Like something that like the user can basically, this is useful for the user, right? This is useful for the driver. Those are the big things that I think of. There's a ton of stuff that goes into each of these, right? Like mobile apps designs, and that has to have its own thing. Inventory management is a huge thing. I'm just gonna glossing over. I mean, that's also, you mentioned this too, but it's individual inventory management for this individual warehouse versus whatever the global database might hold. And the way I'm thinking of these is like, this is kind of like our, oh boy, like a front end here, right? Can I just copy these maybe? Oh wow, okay, cool. And then this is a back end here where we've got this experience, and they're kind of working together. And front end's going to our back end here. It's very, and then we would have our actual, I guess I'm saying inventory management as a system. We'd also have some type of actual database. Like if this is the thing handling the inventory management, right? The database is what's
you
holding
need some
that
sort
information.
That's some sort of API layer, and then some sort of database layer that the API layer talks to.
So that's high level what I think we like the pieces I think we would need as far as like how we would do that. I guess that's the part we can have a conversation around is like, okay, what are our constraints, right? Like, do we have, I know GoPuff is a startup and kind of nimbly. Do we have a ton of funding? Do we have, are we trying to get an MVP out so we can launch against some competitor, right? I guess, what does that look like?
Let's say for the sake of this question, we are a mid-sized startup. Maybe we have 3 or 4 teams. We have a team that works on the user or the end user application. We have a team that works on the driver experience. We have a platform team. And let's just say that we have 3 teams for now. And those teams might want to have some sort of separation between their part of the application and the other team's part of the application, so that they don't step on each other's toes and make each other angry working on the same parts of the code base. So just as like a little thing to keep in mind.
Is that where, having not done microservices work, is that where microservices would come into play, where like maybe we can pull some of this out?
Potentially. We could also use the same system, but just have a little bit of separation between like, where's the driver API, where's the user API, or whatever we want to do. And I know that like GoPuff in real life has different levels of users. Like if you pay a monthly subscription fee, you can get discounts on products. Let's not include that functionality for right now.
So our users are all
the
structured.
same. They all have the same, they all have the same sort of account. They all see the same price.
Yeah, let's see. Cool.
So
Great.
yeah, I think we're looking for MVP, but something that's shippable.
Yeah, MVP we'd actually want to see in the market, right? Not MVP to raise some funding.
Yeah, not MVP to just like to a like just coding challenge that I'm gonna make a Rails app in 2 days and call it a day.
Yeah. Do we have a target number of users or number of users we have now?
Let's pretend that we are in the very early stages and we are rolling it out in like 2 neighborhoods.
Okay.
So assuming that we have, a certain percentage of people in those neighborhoods, that maybe gives us like 5,000 users.
Cool. 5,000 users.
Off the bat, that's my off the cuff estimate of how
Great.
many people live in North Seattle or how many people live in North Seattle who might want to use GoPuff.
Yeah. Great. Okay, that's helpful. So we're not necessarily thinking about, or not necessarily worried about scale at this point. It's something, right? But it's not hundreds of thousands. So that's helpful. No. If we did, I'd give you my hand wavy answer. We could have some type of load balancer, right? That might sit in between these things if we needed to worry about that.
Yeah, let's assume for now that we don't really need to do like scaling for scaling's sake.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, a couple different routes we could go. We could focus on maybe, so we're probably going to have like, I have these like next to these user driver things, but these are kind of like different systems. If I think of them as like platforms, maybe this isn't the best way to think, but they're almost like different repos, right? Like this is going to be a chunk of the code base. This is going to be a chunk of the code base that each of our teams might sit on. Like each of these things. These I think of as more like, these are going to be database models, right? That we might have to build. What area might be interesting? And then I guess on this side, we could have, nice design, whatever you want to spend time on of like fleshing out any of these, the design piece or like the database stuff. Any area you're interested in focusing on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's focus a little bit on some of the like database and inventory management, because I would assume that we would have a designer that would have a nice design and have a good user experience. But I'm just a little bit more curious about how we would design all the stuff under the hood.
Yeah, cool. Then for various models, we'd want a user, which would have real slow attributes on it we could list. But I don't see anything that would be like all that different than what you would expect in really any kind of user setting. We're going to have address. We're going to have, if they're all the same level, we don't have to really cover too much. They might be associated with some type of neighborhood, right? Or warehouse.
I'm guessing a user might actually have more than one address if they've used it in multiple places.
Yeah.
So we might want to keep that in mind, that a user might have more than one address, and then we need a way of verifying that a new address that they've added is within the delivery radius. So that might be an interesting question.
Yeah. Interesting. Maybe some type of like warehouse, whatever we want to associate them with a specific one, right?
I'm guessing we probably need a database table or some sort of entry for a warehouse where its delivery radius is.
Yeah.
However we would want to store that information. I have a tiny bit of experience using like GeoJSON and storing data points about locations, but I'm going to hand wave that for right now and say that there's going to be some way of storing the location and the radius.
Yeah. Cool. So something like that, and then it's gonna, if I get my terminology right, and all of a sudden this is gonna get ugly, but a warehouse will have many users, so it's gonna have some connection with this user, right? It has many users.
Or does it have many users, or is it just that the address is gets associated with a specific warehouse? So a warehouse would have many addresses.
That makes sense.
That might be a slightly different data model since there might be many per user.
Yeah. I think that makes more sense than necessarily. We don't really care if the user is associated with this warehouse. We care if the address is associated with this warehouse, right? I think that makes sense. Address has many, because a user could have multiple addresses too, right? So we want to, okay. So rather than warehouse, we really need to have that. Great. That's the big ones I see. And then driver, I feel like that's actually a more complex. Well, we have the same stuff, right? Like basically, employment related stuff, right? Like we might keep some of that stuff here. I'll just hand away some of that, right?
Yeah, let's hand wave that for now and talk about the things that they would need in order to complete a delivery.
Yeah. So they're going to be connected to. So unlike users, they probably will be connected to a warehouse, right? Because it's kind of the reverse. They don't necessarily care about addresses. They care about they're in this warehouse, which then has many addresses they might deliver to. So
yeah. And that's an interesting question. I'm actually not sure whether GoPuff itself, if you are a driver, if you might pick up things at multiple locations, or whether you are centered around one location. I don't know.
Let's say for our MVP, we've got has one, right? Like you can just go to one.
For our MVP, I work in this neighborhood, and I work in this warehouse.
Yes. Okay, so then we want this one. Drivers has many. Okay. Is there anything else? We could probably have I'm sure this is much more complex, but maybe they don't deliver beef, right? Like I'm sure there's tons of things that you can have specific, but let's put that under employment, or maybe restrictions, like are they under 21 so they can't deliver booze?
There might be alcohol restrictions. Things like that.
Booze. Saying vegan, something. Okay, that type of stuff, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I think that makes sense. What else might we need in our database? We got drivers, warehouse users, address. I guess we need addresses, right?
So the question, addresses, and then I have one more. I think we probably need some record of a product, not necessarily the stock, like whether that product is in the inventory. But what I'm guessing is that a service like GoPuff has a limited number of products that they stock. So for each product that they carry, we probably need an entry for that product that is separate from whether it's in stock or how many or where they're located.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. So if we have products, basically just, do we carry this thing? And probably some information around that product, right? Like again, I'm talking this under like employment related, like the normal stuff you would assume would be on this, which might be name, some type of ID.
All the product details, what size it is.
Weight, whatever.
The price,
however we're doing weight size,
I'm guessing would be pretty important.
Yeah, that type of stuff. Cool. And then so it kind of brings up some other stuff of like, if this is just a list of products, then we would probably have within the warehouse, we would have but it would as like, I don't know if we'd want to, we probably need a separate table to be like inventory, right? Like the inventory of these
Yeah.
products, which might be related to our warehouse.
Mhm.
Like probably something like that.
Yeah. And that's one where inventory, like a product wouldn't necessarily need to change in real time, right?
Yeah, right.
But an inventory would need to change in real time. They
Yeah.
would need to know, like at a moment's notice, how many of these have been ordered, how many are in the warehouse. So if I were a back-end engineer, I would probably know more about how to handle this, but my front-end engineer brain is kind of hand-waving it and saying, oh yeah, we just need something that is able to be kept up to date really quickly. So we would want to make sure we don't have any like caching or anything that's going to get in the way of that.
Yeah. 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 Cool. I think that's probably if I'm being honest, the limit of like my ability to do back like database
Yeah.
like modeling
Yeah.
of like, okay, these things I know exist. There's probably much more complex relationships
Yeah.
that these would have. We could flesh this out. But I think that's like
Yeah.
okay, we know they need these things, and there might be some other stuff, but I think that might be a good place for these.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, that is mine too. I know all the basics around like I'm gonna have a table and it's gonna have these fields and it's a
Yeah.
one-to-many. And but where I struggle too is in going further than that and knowing, okay, like what are the other than like this team is working on, like let's say we had a team that is working on the inventory management. That might be a good argument for it being a microservice or something that lives outside of the main application because they want to completely control it and not have to deploy it with with the monolith application or have a little bit more autonomy. But those decisions are much more often driven by team needs than by a specific technical need.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny when you mentioned like this is sometimes a difficult thing to interview about if you haven't done this a lot.
Yeah.
Episode 5 of this show, I think I got a system design interview when I was like 3 months into engineering, and I was like, I just don't know. Like I built like one thing,
Yeah.
you know. And it's kind of fun now to be like, okay, at least I get this a little bit more.
Uh-huh.
But it is tough if you have like a lot of times it is manager leads, right, who might be making these decisions, and even then you might not, depending on the role, right. If you're in consulting, you might not necessarily do that, right? Or if you just work at a large company where there's not a ton of greenfield stuff and you're mostly improving on other
Yeah.
things, right?
You're working in your one little piece of the application. Or a lot of my experience when it has been greenfield, it's been like, okay, we're going to start with a Rails API. We're going to run Rails new and we're going to add tables X, Y, and Z. And then we're going to set up the API and we're going to set up the front end and call it a day.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily give you an idea of how to run things at scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Do we want to tackle one of these? I haven't really done this before in a system design interview. It's kind of been like, we got a front end, we got this like
Yeah.
other stuff, and then we got a database. But like actually thinking what goes into this and what, like how this might work might be interesting.
Yeah. I think that is really interesting. And yeah, we should talk a little bit more about that. From a front end perspective, something that I'm thinking is we would need a way of polling or subscribing to this inventory management service. Because on the front end, if I am like browsing this product and I go to put it in my cart, I need to have like the most up-to-date information
Yeah.
about whether that is available. Like maybe there were only 2 of them left and somebody just grabbed them. Like I don't want to go through the ordering process and then have to speak to a customer service person or get a different product that's not the same thing. Or
Yeah.
so having some sort of API or subscription that allows me to get that information quickly would be really, really helpful.
Yeah. I think that's key. Like this is API driven, right? We're doing if we're on this main page, it's been a while since I used GoPuff, I'm assuming I'm scrolling down, right? And it's kind of buffers along the way, right? And every time that's loading, we're making some type of GET request to get whatever the most recent inventory for these various locations are, right?
Yep.
That makes sense to me. I'm just gonna put these terms here because I feel like that's what people like to see. So some type of GET request for the inventory, and then if a basically purchase made, we'll need to pass that information along, right? Then we need some type of post request, which probably involved in checkout, or you could have a bunch of other stuff involved with that. But basically, that's also going to need to update the inventory, right?
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm wondering about is, do we think that like, let's say we have an API, like get the inventory or get the availability for a specific product. Do we see that being a separate request from the like get all products, or do we see that data being aggregated together so that we get all the products and the inventory for that product?
That's a good question.
Personally, I could see there being trade-offs to both. Like having one request would be easier, but if I had to constantly pull or update, there's a much higher chance that like products are just going to disappear or move around while I'm looking at it.
Yeah, well, if I'm thinking like at this stage, it might make sense to do the full poll. We just get everything, right? But like I feel like I've had this or been a part of this in the past where it's like, great, oh, we're at the point where we don't have 5K users anymore. It's 50K, right? So it's like now we need to actually make these requests. It's going to take 4 seconds or even 2 seconds for this request to come back, right? And that's way too long when you're scrolling on your phone. You're going to go to Instagram instead, right? So like just having that would I think right now having everything come is probably fine. So we've set up our database nicely and it's quick. Probably as we scale and maybe relatively quickly, it's going to get to a point where like, okay, we need to have more frequent requests or returning some subset where maybe we're optimizing for like just certain sets of products, right? Yeah, that's probably I think that's a thing where it would likely be like implement something and then it's going to change as you scale. It's probably unlikely you get it right on the first try, right?
Yeah, definitely. If we wanted to talk about specific technologies, I know like I think having some sort of middle layer, like a GraphQL API or something that sits in between our API layer and our front end might be a good way to go. That way, if we do make changes to the way that we requested, if we have like, we request a list of products and then for each product, we request the availability, that's kind of hidden from the front end implementation.
Yeah, I like
and I
that.
could see that being a good approach for us.
I haven't really worked with GraphQL, but that makes sense of like being able to do this in a way where it's sustainable, right? We don't
have a little bit of abstraction so that you aren't tying all of your business logic around how you fetch this data to your front end code. That's my front end engineer perspective, at least.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. GraphQL.
So
just vaguely say GraphQL here.
yeah, that's fine.
We'll handle that problem.
Yeah. So I was wondering, if you had to choose a specific tech stack here,
Hmm.
do you think you would have an opinion on that?
Sure. For me, it's going to be a full stack JavaScript application because that's what I'm the most familiar with.
Yeah.
If I'm leading this team and building this, and I have done work, it's definitely different, and the live nature of it would be pretty different. But I have done work at like scales greater than this in it was basically vanilla JavaScript and Bootstrap and Node backend or Next backend, and it scaled fairly well. The
Mhm.
live nature of this inventory might make that more difficult because definitely there was some issues with the database as things continue to grow. But I think,
Yeah.
if we have a team of smart engineers, we could probably build that,
Mhm.
and it could work fine. The main advantage for that, apart from it's my preference, is just being able to have one language across the back end and the front end where we're not having to just syntax stuff. I feel like it's so like difficult. We're like, okay, great, we got a Rails backend, we got to go figure out. I know how to do this in JavaScript. Now
Yeah.
I got to remember how to do this in Rails. Right? It's sometimes a little frustrating, especially if you have separated teams where it's mostly working on the front end versus mostly working on the back end. It's harder to maybe help out or pick up the context as easy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I feel like every time I've been asked that question, I will have a similar answer in terms of, well, I know JavaScript. If it were just me, that's what I would choose.
Yeah.
But it's always an interesting question when they ask you about a specific stack, which this
Mhm.
has happened to me multiple times recently. But it had like in every actual job I've been in, the stack that we use is very much determined by what they're already using.
Yeah.
What do your engineers know? What is there a specific reason to pivot away from a specific technology that you're using? I know people have lots of opinions around like Go is faster for microservices or whatever, but I
Mhm.
don't know. It's always hard to know what the correct answer is there.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of well, not having a ton of like experience being like, I made the decision to move away to this thing. I feel like in a much smaller scale, like I've made the decision between using regular fetch requests and Axios and like what was the benefits
Mhm.
or the trade-off of that. And a lot of times it is convenience and like how readable is this, right? If you ask me for like you know, the best answer possible, I'd say, well, we could probably make this the most efficient, most optimized. We wrote it in C++ or something, right? But
Oh yeah.
I can't tell you why it's going to be better in C++ other than, some C++ engineer would probably tell me that, right?
Yeah. And I
And
know like in general, people like Ruby is or Rails specifically is not very scalable. I can't tell
yeah,
you why.
yeah.
I've heard that. I know that that's the case.
Right. So I always even hesitant to say like, oh, I'd use Rails because people are like the scalability issues. I'm also like, yeah, I also work at a company that has a Rails backend that serves millions and millions of customers, right? Like,
Hmm.
but Groupon moved away from it for some reason, right? I guess at a certain point it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a hard one. I feel like I'm better at answering like why might we have like use this very specific piece of technology versus another one. And even in that like
Hmm.
Node example, like the company I worked for, we moved away from Gulp at one point, which is doing a lot of like data streaming stuff for us. That's why we were moving to Next, so we could kind of get away from that, because it was like we were hitting bottlenecks of like we were trying to process these pages and do this data streaming with, I don't know, and you get past like 1,000 data points, it
Hmm.
was more and more difficult, right? Versus like, oh, we actually can connect to a real backend to do this instead of just trying to funnel it through all these weird ways that we were doing it. So I think a lot of
Yeah.
times it's what works until you realize, oh, it's too slow. Now let's figure out something else, right?
Hmm. Yeah. And I think if I were an interviewer asking that question, I would have some things that would be red flags for like if this person said, um, I would build the front end entirely in closure scripts because anything that's not functional programming is just terrible.
Yeah.
Like I would want to know, are you thinking about the trade-offs for the team? Are you
Mm.
thinking about the trade-offs for the company, what we're already invested in, what's easier to learn.
Yeah.
Because I do think that sometimes we get really caught up in like, this is what I like. This is what works for me. And therefore everyone else has to do what works for me because it's just better. And seeing that a person is able to talk about those trade-offs or make a business case for why we would use one thing over another, or they're able to be flexible, I think that might have some value.
Yeah. I think it's probably a great question to ask was what would you build this in? This first question be, okay, what does the team know, right? If we're assuming we got 3 teams, they know something, right? I might have my preference, but if all the team prefers Go and I say JavaScript's better, I should probably use Go. I probably should use JavaScript.
And that's not to say that in a real world context, there wouldn't be different reasons for having one service in one language and another in a different language. You know, maybe you're transitioning to TypeScript and Node and you're no longer using Python or whatever your previous service was. But there has to be a business case or an argument for it other than just this is cooler, this is shinier.
Yeah.
At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, it makes sense. Cool. Are there any other areas you want to touch on here or things we should dig into?
I think I just have some general questions, if you don't mind talking a little bit in general about this exercise.
Sure. Yeah.
If you were the interviewer in this context, like, what do you think you would be looking for? I know I touched a little bit on like what I would be looking for in a language choice, but in general, what would you be looking for and what sort of things would you be evaluating here?
Yeah, I guess because I've seen this like format before, like basically kind of diagramming out a little bit of like, how does this flow work? I guess I'm looking for that to some extent, right? Like something to show me basically to show me you've seen this before, right? Which sucks if you haven't, but to like, have you seen this? And then I think this is the big thing, right? Like I jumped right into this because that was like top of mind for me, but asking the questions, like this could all drastically change if you say we have, like I said, if we have 100 Google engineers that we can put on it tomorrow, right? It's a totally different question. So I think doing these questions of like, let me get some constraints, let me figure this stuff out, is probably the main thing that we should figure out before someone jumps into it. And if they just jump into it, that to me might say, okay, they're coming from more of an engineering mindset than a manager or an architect mindset, which is fine, but it may not be what you're looking for if you're looking for someone to manage a team or to help make larger scale decisions, right, about the direction your company is going to go or your technology is going to go. That's probably the 2 main things.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up that you might be looking for a different mindset from a manager versus an engineer. Like what does that, do you mind elaborating a little bit more?
Yeah,
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think about so when I've probably done the most interviewing of people in the past, it was when I was running a recruiting office. And what I often like how I was trying to level was like, what is your impact? And to hire like let's say a recruiter level 1, right? Was like, you can run your own desk, meaning you can bring in candidates that we can send to jobs, right? A recruiter level 2 can like bring in candidates that we can send to jobs, but also can generate new clients, right? So they not only impact themselves, right? They also are helping the recruiter ones, right? And then a recruiter 3, or maybe when I get into a lead or a senior, is like they can do that, but they can also coach the other people on how to get better at these things, right? So now they're not just making an impact on the team, they're making an impact probably on the entire office, right? Because hopefully they're doing good coaching, we're all kind of getting better. And then a manager is like, they can manage all of those people, actually manage those reports, and then also do a lot of that coaching, have the other skills along the way. So I just try to think of like, what is the impact? Like, are they just, if you're an SE1, your job is to take tickets, finish the ticket, right?
Yeah.
You probably don't have a lot of input on like, what are you, like, how are you actually implementing this? Or maybe some, but you're probably not deciding like, what is the business problem that we're solving here, right? That's already been done.
Mhm.
SC2, you start to get into a little bit more of like, okay, I'm looking at the business problem. Let's actually figure out what we need to build. Senior, like that's probably like maybe you're part of that grooming process. Like you're actually figuring out what is the problem, and then how do we translate that into a technical solution. Then I think lead management, it's that, but also managing people, making architecture decisions that's going to impact more and more people. It's like long-winded way of saying like how much impact do you have, and if someone jumps just into this, that probably means that that's what they've done before. Someone's told them you
Mhm.
need to design this, and they go great, but they took for granted that there was 5 years of getting to this point, or someone had a fundraise so we could afford to have 3 teams, right? And that was all part of this decision-making process.
Yeah. And something that I touched on a little bit earlier, but something that I think a manager or somebody in a higher level, like a senior level person, should be thinking about is not just okay, what is the ideal technical case here? We have, 5 database tables and an API layer and a front end, maybe a microservice over here. Not just the like, what is the best technical solution, but what is doable? What are the needs of your teams specifically? Because so many of our architecture decisions are driven not just by a technical constraint of like, oh, we have 5,000 users, we need to make sure that we have fast response times for 5,000 users. There's also all the added constraints of where are your teams working? How much autonomy do those teams have? How often do these teams need to deploy without affecting code over here? Things like that. And something that I've been trying to figure out in this interview like as I've gone through some of these interviews has been how valuable is that sort of line of thinking in a system design interview? Because like I said, in the real world, those are the things that I would primarily consider as a senior level or a manager, like not just what's technically best, but how do we do it? There's a lot of things that technically would be a lot better, but when we only have 4 engineers on this team and we aren't able to hire another one and we're working with a very limited time and budget, where do we make those compromises?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had some insight, but that's the stuff I don't. That's the stuff I don't think about right now at all. Like, so
I'm more just throwing it out there, and if in case somebody in the broader world has context on this, I would be very interested, because it's hard to fit these sorts of interviews into that real world context, I think.
Totally.
And that, especially as a consultant, I've been in so many real world contexts where we're on a like shoestring budgets and a very short timeline, and we only have 3 engineers and they're asking for a clone of Figma or like something really complex. And it's not even a question of, is it technically possible? It's a question of, but can we do it with this team size, with this company, with this technical setup that we already have, that we're already invested in?
Yeah. I love that. That's like part of the thinking though for you, because I think the questions aren't asked often enough, and that's how managers or teams get in a bad spot where they go, "Great, yeah, we can do this," and then, "Oh no, we can't do this." Right. So I think that's a good part, and I think asking those questions in these types of interviews, or maybe in like, assuming this goes well, you have the conversation with the CTO, whoever you might be reporting to. I think in those types of conversations might even be more beneficial of saying, great, like I know that this, in an ideal situation, we might do X, Y, and Z, but what does it actually look like, right? Because those are the things I'm thinking about a lot. And I think I have to think the higher up, like those are the people who are actually thinking about those things more often. Because they have to, right? The CTO has to decide, can we actually do this thing we want to do? Is this really cool product idea or not? Right. And then it slowly gets filtered down. Right? So that's interesting.
Yeah. The higher up you go, the more you have to think about all the real constraints
Yeah.
And I know that that's something that like junior engineers, you show up to work and you're working in Ruby and you're like, oh, I hate Ruby. We should work in JavaScript. And like,
Yeah.
that's the end of your thought process because you like JavaScript better and it would be better for you. As the manager, you have to say, okay, well, is that good for the business? And as the CTO, you have to say, well, do we have, are we expanding our teams? Can we have a separate team that does JavaScript, or like what's the meta use case for that?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how the things that you're concerned about change over time.
Yeah, totally.
So
Great. Any other questions for me you wanted to talk through?
I guess I'm just wondering, like, your opinion on system design interviews at all. Yes or no? They exist. We use them a lot. A lot of companies rely pretty extensively on them as a part of our interview process. The companies that I've worked for don't tend to rely on them because of just some of the challenges and some of the ways that it might select certain people who are good at certain things but exclude other people. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I will say if someone has less than like 3-4 years of experience, you shouldn't give them a system design interview. Like that's my like probably the strongest opinion that I have about system design interviews, mostly because if they haven't actually made those decisions in the past, all they're really doing, if they're actually good at it, is just knowing what you want to hear and then spitting that out. But they haven't actually done that. Like I haven't actually done this, right? But I've just been in a handful of system design interviews, feel like I'm a little bit better than I used to be, right? And I used to be really bad at it because I haven't actually done this work. So I think that's reminding us, like, are they useful? I can recall at least on one occasion where a lead engineer, founding engineer at a company that I was at, sat down and whiteboarded out, this is what our new architecture looks like, right? And basically did the system design. I mean, they had already thought through this and this is what we were going to implement. But it was incredibly helpful for me as someone who's just taken orders at that company, right? That, okay, this is how all these things connect. That you're saying GraphQL, but I don't actually know what that does, right? Okay, here's where it actually sits, right? That makes sense. Oh, this is why we need an API now, right? We can't just keep calling it. Oh, okay, great. Like that was helpful. So I do think like it is a skill that has some value, right? How often does one need to do that? I don't know. Should it be brought up in an interview? Is it important enough to have like 45 minutes in this interview? I don't know. Maybe it depends on the company and how much like greenfield work they're doing, or like are they constantly thinking about this type of stuff? I just know I've been interviewed for SE1 roles or SE2 roles that had system design interviews where I always go, okay, like I don't know why you're asking me how to design this thing because I'm not going to do that here. The senior engineer probably isn't even doing that there. Like the lead might not be doing that there. It's like the architect is the only one who's actually doing this work. So why are you asking me? I guess you want to hear something, right? So I'll do my best, but I think it's silly for certain levels. Unless you're just looking for like how much does this person know broadly about tech, but they haven't actually done this thing likely.
I would say I'm in a similar place where in theory I see some value, but when I think about the day-to-day work that I do, at least, I never make these decisions. I'm almost always walking into a situation where it's already like it already exists. We already have a system. We already have all the different layers, and I'm just working on a little tiny piece of it. Or even if I'm starting in like a greenfield application, it's usually a pretty MVP setup.
Yeah.
And it's so rare that I actually get to be the one making a decision about like, okay, do we have 2 microservices or do we have 1 monolith? Do we have where are our database tables? What things are on them? What are our layers in between the database and the front end? And it does feel a little bit like these questions are a little bit exclusionary. first of all, to people who haven't had that experience, or if you're like me and you've worked in only a specific context, they could be a really great engineer working in that specific context or that specific part of the API, or that specific part of the stack. And it almost feels like your experience depends more on what specific company have you worked for, what choices have they made.
Yeah.
And it does make it a little bit harder as a job seeker to get through these sorts of interviews when you've had a very specific experience that's been determined by where you've worked.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear that. Yeah. I feel like it's such a tough problem. And knowing how bad interviews are in general, just interviews are like, why do you interview the way that you do? Most people go, like they don't necessarily have not like they went through reasoning on like, this is how we developed the interview process. It's like, oh, that's what our person who hired me, that's how they interviewed me. So we got to do the same thing. Right. Or like, oh, that's what someone told me to do. Okay. So knowing that like a good chunk of the time, it's kind of just a toss together process in general, probably means someone at some point said, oh, we should do a system design interview. And goes, okay, great. So now it's a part of the process. No one really knows why. No one actually does that work. Or there's, a very small set of people that actually do that work at the company. And it may or may not be the people that are being interviewed for it. Right. So yeah, I agree. It's I think a piece of the interview process that is often in there that probably doesn't need to be. And if there is some skill set that someone's trying to ascertain from this, one, I would love to hear about it, especially if it's an earlier career people. But two, I would be very interested in talking about, is there another way to get that same signal, right? Like without doing what we just did, can you figure out, can someone manage projects and lead teams? Probably, right?
Yeah, and I definitely think that there is a skill that we can get from this, which is, can you talk through your thought process? Can you think through things systematically? Can you, I actually think this might be a good case to introduce the opportunity of researching. Like, can you research this and find out what the best approach might be? Like, where would you go? What sorts of questions would you ask? And so often these interviews, at least the system design ones, are just like, can you name this off the top of your head? But I think that there are some scenarios where we could use something like this to get the idea of how would you approach this problem. Something that I would be really curious about is if I were making an interview process from scratch, I might do something along the lines of, here's a specific scenario. We have team A, B, and C that are working on these parts of the application. Team B and C are getting into some conflict because they're working too closely together. We have some technical difficulties, such as, requests are being routed through, are sometimes going to the wrong place, or we're getting a lot of errors coming from this service. Like, tell me how you would approach that specific scenario. What technical options would you offer? How would that influence the teams? Maybe if you did propose a specific language, you could say, okay, well, here are the languages that we use. This person has a really strong opinion about using a TypeScript or something else. Make it as real world as possible. If I were designing this interview, I think that's what I would do. Yeah,
I like it. And I think it's like you said, real world, it's realistic. It's something you actually probably do in this job, right? Like I think as much as you can try to tie things to real life and what the job actually is, not only makes it a better interview process, but it also shows people what it's going to be like to work there, right? Like if I do a system design interview for an SE1 role, I'm not going to do that at the company, right? So it's like,
no,
why? It wasn't
nobody's
really
asking my opinion here.
Yeah, it's not a reflection of my skills. It's also not a reflection of what you're going to ask me to do at the company. So what was the point, right? So yeah, it's interesting. Well, I like this. I haven't thought too deeply about system design interviews in the past, other than I didn't like them because I wasn't very good at them. So now I feel like I actually have some thinking to do on what does the purpose serve, and I'm open to people saying, oh no, we use them for this reason, and okay, great, now maybe I have some justification for them, but this is enlightening to me.
Yeah, definitely. And unfortunately, if you are in the position of a candidate, we don't really have any say over what other companies use as their interview process. But as an interviewer, I perhaps have a little bit more say in how this happens and who I'm including, who I'm excluding, what I'm looking for, how I'm setting this sort of question up.
So in the future, if you're watching this and you hate system design interviews and you want something better, go find Becca and apply for wherever you're working.
I'll keep you up to date. We'll see where that is.
Yeah. Great. Anything you want to plug or anything else you want to mention before we go?
I am starting a Substack blog. It is called Performance Anxiety. I will make sure I send that link to Taylor so he can include it in any show notes or any information that he sends out. But I am starting to write about these sorts of things because I no longer want to use Twitter and still want to have a way of sharing my thoughts. So if you want to hear about my extended thoughts on tech teams and interviews and all that kind of stuff, you should read my blog and subscribe.
Cool. I'll put that in the show notes so folks can find it. Thanks so much. This was super fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional technical interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.